February 16, 1944. The Factory, Anzio Beachhead, Italy. Before dawn, German infantry and armor of the newly reinforced 14th Army advance out of the fog toward the shattered ruins of Aprilia, a small industrial settlement the soldiers on both sides have taken to calling simply the Factory, the anchor point of the Allied beachhead's most exposed sector. It is the opening blow of Operation Fischfang, the largest concentrated German counteroffensive of the entire Italian campaign, intended to collapse the beachhead entirely before it can grow into the threat to Rome that Allied planners had originally envisioned. German infantry push forward behind a heavy artillery preparation, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, and in the opening hours the attack achieves real gains, driving elements of the defending British and American units back from forward positions they have held for weeks. Forward observers on both sides, straining to track the shifting line through fog and smoke thickened further by burning vehicles, struggle for the first hour to distinguish friendly positions from enemy advances close enough in places that the two sides are fighting through the same shattered buildings from opposite ends of the same street. Then the ground behind the advancing German infantry begins to erupt in a density of shellfire that veterans of years of combat on multiple fronts later describe as unlike anything they have previously experienced. American and British field artillery, reinforced by corps and Army-level heavy guns packed into an unusually compact beachhead, combined with the naval guns of cruisers and destroyers standing offshore, all coordinated through an observation and fire control network built specifically to answer exactly this kind of concentrated attack. German formations that had broken through in the initial assault find themselves unable to hold or exploit the ground they have taken, isolated by curtains of artillery fire that make reinforcement or resupply of the forward positions all but impossible. By the time the offensive is finally called off 4 days later, German losses are severe enough that the attack that had been intended to eliminate the beachhead entirely instead confirms, for the German High Command, a lesson that will shape the rest of the Italian campaign, that the greatest danger facing an attacking force at Anzio is not the infantry holding the line, but the artillery waiting behind it. The popular version of this story imagines Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the senior German commander in Italy, personally delivering this exact verdict to Berlin in the immediate aftermath of Fischfang's failure. A single, decisive report crystallizing the lesson of the battle in one clear voice. The documented record is messier, and in its way, more honest about how military lessons actually form. Kesselring is genuinely present throughout the Anzio campaign, commanding the Italian theater from his own headquarters and directly overseeing the effort to contain and then eliminate the beachhead. Unlike several of the commanders whose reputations this kind of story often depends upon, he does not need to be reconstructed from a distance or excused for having been elsewhere. But the specific, polished assessment that American and British artillery, not infantry, represented the decisive threat at Anzio does not arrive at his headquarters as a single dramatic conclusion in the days after February 20th. It emerges instead from a flood of after-action reports filed by exhausted division and corps commanders across the 14th Army, particularly from General Eberhard von Mackensen's own staff, each describing broadly the same experience in their own sector. Infantry advances succeeding tactically, only to be shattered by artillery concentrations before the gains could be consolidated. Kesselring's role is to receive, synthesize, and forward this collective judgment up the chain of command to Berlin, not to have originated it himself in a single moment of insight. The clean, singular version of the story, one field marshal, one verdict, one message to Berlin, comes together most clearly not in the wartime dispatches themselves, but years later, in Kesselring's own post-war memoir, where the collective experience of dozens of unit commanders across a brutal week of fighting is compressed, understandably, but not quite accurately, into his own retrospective voice. To understand why Kesselring is even in a position to receive that flood of reports, and why Anzio unfolds the way it does, the story has to go back to the broader Italian campaign that brings him to Mediterranean command in the first place. Kesselring begins the war as a Luftwaffe officer, having helped build the German Air Force from its earliest days in the 1930s, despite an army rather than aviation background. a career path unusual enough among senior Luftwaffe officers that he had originally transferred from the Army's artillery branch in 1933, tasked by Hermann Göring with organizing the new service's administrative and training structures before ever commanding it in combat, and commands Luftflotte II during the Battle of Britain and the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa before being transferred to the Mediterranean Theater in late 1941 as Commander-in-Chief South, a position that eventually places him in overall command of German forces defending Italy following the collapse of Mussolini's regime and Italy's surrender to the Allies in September 1943. His command during the defense of Sicily in the summer of 1943, though it ends in Allied conquest of the island, is widely regarded even by his opponents as a skillfully conducted fighting withdrawal that successfully evacuates the vast majority of German forces and equipment across the Strait of Messina before Allied forces can trap them on the island entirely, an operation that further cements his reputation for extracting the maximum possible result from a strategically hopeless position. Kesselring earns a reputation, both among his own subordinates and among Allied commanders studying his conduct of the campaign, as an unusually skilled defensive strategist, someone who consistently extracts more resistance from difficult terrain and limited forces than Allied planners anticipate. A reputation that earns him the nickname Smiling Albert for a personal optimism that persists even as the military situation in Italy grows steadily more difficult through late 1943. A temperament that some of his own staff officers later describe as genuinely reassuring to subordinates during the campaign's most difficult stretches, rather than mere performance for its own sake. His signature achievement by early 1944 is the construction and defense of the Gustav Line, a formidable series of fortified positions stretching across the width of the Italian peninsula and anchored by the seemingly impregnable heights around Monte Cassino, which has already repelled several costly Allied assaults by the time the Anzio operation begins. It is precisely this stalemate at the Gustav Line that produces Operation Shingle, the amphibious landing at Anzio and Nettuno that begins on January 22, 1944. Conceived largely at Winston Churchill's insistence as a way to break the deadlock in southern Italy, the plan calls for an amphibious force to land well behind German lines, threatening Rome directly and forcing Kesselring to either abandon the Gustav Line to meet the new threat or risk having his own forces cut off from the Italian capital entirely. Churchill had pressed for the operation over the reservations of several American planners, who worried about diverting landing craft and shipping already committed to preparations for the far larger cross-channel invasion, planned for later that year. A tension between the Mediterranean and Northern European priorities that runs through Allied strategic planning for much of 1944. The landing itself achieves near-complete tactical surprise, meeting only light resistance from the limited German forces actually stationed in the immediate area, and Major General John P. Lucas's 6th Corps comes ashore with remarkably few casualties on the first day, securing a beachhead several miles deep, with German defenders in the immediate vicinity numbering only in the hundreds rather than the substantial garrison Allied intelligence had feared might be waiting. It is what happens next that becomes one of the more debated command decisions of the entire Italian campaign. Lucas, mindful of the near-disaster Allied forces had experienced during the amphibious landing at Salerno only months earlier, when a slower-than-expected advance inland had nearly allowed German forces to drive the beachhead back into the sea, chooses to consolidate his position methodically rather than immediately pushing his forces toward the Alban Hills overlooking the road to Rome, a decision Churchill later criticizes in characteristically vivid terms, remarking that he had hoped to see a wildcat hurled onto the shore only to find, instead, a beached whale. The pause gives Kesselring precisely the window he needs. Kesselring's response to the landing, whatever surprise its location and timing initially produce, is remarkably fast and well organized. Within days, his headquarters begins pulling divisions from across Italy, from occupation duties in France and the Balkans, and from strategic reserves held further north, assembling them under the newly activated 14th Army command structure placed under General Eberhard von Mackensen, specifically to manage the Anzio sector. Units arrive from as far away as northern Italy and southern France within the first week. A logistical achievement that reflects both the priority Kesselring's headquarters assigns to containing the new threat and the relatively short distances involved, compared to the kind of theater-spanning redeployments German commanders on the Eastern Front were regularly forced to attempt. By the time Lucas's forces finally begin pushing more aggressively inland in late January, they find German resistance stiffening rapidly rather than the thin covering force that had greeted the initial landing, and by early February, the operational initiative has shifted decisively toward the German side of the beachhead perimeter. With Kesselring's forces launching a series of probing attacks throughout the first half of February, intended to test and weaken Allied defensive positions ahead of a larger, decisive offensive. That offensive arrives on February 16th as Operation Fischfang, assembled with a concentration of force that represents, by this point in the Italian campaign, one of the largest single German efforts of the entire theater. Multiple infantry divisions supported by armor and self-propelled guns, directed at the narrowest and most exposed sector of the Allied perimeter around Aprilia and the Albano Road, held at the point of main attack by British and American units of the 45th Infantry Division and supporting armor, with the explicit goal of splitting the beachhead and driving the defenders back into the sea before Allied reinforcement could restore the line. The initial German advance achieves genuine tactical success, penetrating Allied forward positions, and, in places, threatening to break through to the beaches themselves, a crisis serious enough that Allied commanders at one point consider the possibility of a fighting withdrawal from the most exposed portions of the perimeter, with reserves, including elements pulled from the British 56th Division and American units held in Beachhead Reserve, committed piecemeal to plug gaps as they open along the collapsing front line. What stops the German advance, according to the consistent testimony gathered afterward from unit commanders on both sides, is not primarily the resistance of Allied infantry, though British and American units fight with genuine tenacity in the factory's ruins and along the surrounding rail embankments, but the sheer density and responsiveness of the artillery fire concentrated into an unusually compact beachhead. Allied gunners, benefiting from a fire control and observation system refined over the preceding weeks, specifically to answer exactly this kind of concentrated assault, are able to mass the fire of dozens of artillery battalions onto German formations attempting to exploit their initial gains, a level of concentration made possible precisely because the beachhead's small size places nearly every gun within range of nearly every threatened sector, an advantage of compactness that partially offsets the beachhead's greater vulnerability to encirclement, while naval guns from cruisers and destroyers standing offshore add a further layer of heavy, sustained bombardment that German troops, most of whom have fought primarily against Soviet forces on the Eastern Front before transfer to Italy, describe as unlike any concentration of firepower they had previously experienced. The Soviet artillery many of these veterans had grown accustomed to, while formidable in its own right, rarely combined the density of massed field artillery with the added weight of naval rifles capable of hurling shells the size of those carried by a cruiser's main battery onto a target only a few miles inland, a combination of range, caliber, and coordination that several German after-action reports single out specifically as unlike anything encountered on any other front of the war. German infantry that successfully advances finds itself repeatedly cut off from reinforcement and resupply by artillery barrages that make daylight movement across the exposed beachhead terrain extraordinarily costly, and by February 20th, with German losses mounting and the offensive having failed to achieve its central objective of splitting the beachhead, Kesselring's headquarters calls off the attack. The aftermath of Fischfang's failure produces exactly the kind of collective reassessment that eventually crystallizes into the verdict attributed to Kesselring personally. Division and corps commanders across the 14th Army file reports in the days following the attack that converge, independently of one another, on largely the same conclusion, that German infantry and armor had performed capably, in many cases achieving initial tactical success against determined Allied resistance, but that the volume and precision of Allied artillery fire, rather than any particular tactical brilliance on the part of Allied infantry, had ultimately defeated the attack by making the ground gained impossible to hold or exploit. Mackinson's own staff, closest to the fighting and responsible for compiling the 14th Army's formal assessment of the operation, becomes the primary channel through which this collective judgment reaches Kesselring's headquarters, and it is Kesselring's own subsequent reports forwarding this assessment to Berlin, along with his later, considerably more polished post-war account, that eventually produced the tidy, single-voice version of the verdict now commonly attributed to him. The practical consequence for the German conduct of the campaign is a marked shift in tactics for the months that follow. Rather than risk another costly, concentrated assault against a beachhead now understood to be backed by an artillery and naval gunfire network capable of breaking up any attacking force before it can consolidate gains, German forces around Anzio settle into a more static, entrenched posture through March and April, digging extensive trench networks and fortified positions along a front that barely moves for nearly 3 months, a period both sides later compare, in its grinding character and the density of shell fire exchanged along a narrow, fixed front, to the trench warfare of the previous World War, rather than the mobile campaigns that had defined most of the conflict to that point. Both German and Allied soldiers holding the line through this stretch endure conditions of near-constant harassing fire, patrol actions, and the particular psychological strain of a front that offers no prospect of movement in either direction, a contrast that later historians of the Italian campaign frequently note against the far more mobile fighting that characterizes most other theaters of the war by 1944. The stalemate persists until May 1944, when the broader Allied diadem offensive finally breaks the Gustav line at Monte Cassino, and, in the days that follow, links up with a beachhead force finally breaking out of its own perimeter under General Lucien Truscott, who had replaced Lucas in command of 6th Corps in February, opening the road to Rome, which falls to Allied forces on June 4, 1944, only 2 days before the Normandy landings in France shift the world's attention to a different theater entirely. In the ruins of the factory on the morning of February 20th, as the last German attempts to renew the offensive are called off, and exhausted infantry on both sides begin the grim work of consolidating positions littered with wrecked vehicles and the dead from 4 days of continuous fighting, few of the soldiers involved have any occasion to consider how their own experience will eventually be distilled into a tidy historical verdict attributed to a field marshal directing the battle from well behind the front lines. German infantrymen who survived advances that succeeded tactically only to be annihilated by artillery fire they never saw coming, know, from direct and repeated experience, exactly which weapon had defeated them, not the riflemen and machine gunners they had fought at close range in the factory's shattered buildings, many of whom they had beaten in that fighting, but the guns positioned miles behind the Allied line, directed by observers they never located, that made every yard of ground taken impossible to hold for more than a few hours. Some of these men, writing home or recounting the battle to comrades in the static months of fighting that follow, describe the sensation of advancing successfully only to feel the ground itself seem to turn against them minutes later, an experience of being punished for progress rather than for failure that several post-war interviews with surviving veterans single out as the single most disorienting aspect of the entire battle. Allied artillery observers, forward with the infantry they support and relaying corrections back to batteries positioned throughout the crowded beachhead, have their own more immediate understanding of what their fire accomplished during those 4 days, an understanding that reaches Kesselring's headquarters only second-hand, filtered through the reports of German commanders on the receiving end of it, and that takes years more to settle into the single, retrospective sentence history eventually credits to Kesselring alone. What the story of Fischfang and the verdict that follows it ultimately illustrates is a broader truth about how military lessons of this kind actually take shape, one that the popular attribution to a single commander tends to obscure. The recognition that concentrated, well-coordinated artillery fire could defeat even a well-executed infantry and armor assault was not a flash of individual insight delivered by Kesselring to his superiors in a single dramatic report, but the accumulated, independently arrived at judgment of dozens of officers who had watched their own units succeed tactically and fail operationally within the same brutal week. A judgment that took the ordinary bureaucratic path of after-action reports and staff summaries before Kesselring's headquarters synthesized it into something Berlin could act on. It is a pattern that recurs across many of the war's most quoted strategic insights, a collective, hard-won lesson learned by the men who actually lived through the battle, later attributed in popular memory to the single commander whose name appears at the top of the document that finally carried it up the chain of command. That the story is remembered today as a single field marshal's verdict says less about how the lesson was actually learned than about how history simplifies collective experience into attributable quotes, compressing the testimony of exhausted division commanders and shattered infantry battalions into the voice of the man whose name sits at the top of the reports that carried their conclusions upward. Kesselring earns his reputation as one of the war's most capable defensive commanders honestly, through genuine skill exercised across a difficult and lengthening campaign. From the fighting withdrawal across Sicily to the construction of the Gustav line to his rapid, effective response to the Anzio landing itself. But the specific verdict on Anzio's decisive weapon belongs, in its origin, to the men in the factory's ruins and the gun crews behind the beachhead whose experience he was, in the end, only the messenger for. A distinction that matters less for assigning credit than for understanding how the clearest lessons of any battle are usually written first in the exhausted, unglamorous language of after-action reports, long before they are ever spoken in the polished sentence of a single famous name.